What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video. And today we're going to be talking about the Templar tank. So Templar tanks are not really a tank spec that you'll see very often in endgame trials. They're definitely capable of tanking pretty much every piece of content in the game, but they do lack a couple of things that kind of make Nightblade tanks and Dragonite tanks and Warden tanks kind of a little bit stronger. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad tanks, it just means you might need to work a little bit harder to kind of make up for those downfalls, pitfalls that you might not otherwise have on like a Dragonite or a Nightblade tank. Despite all of this though, I personally find Templar tanks to be pretty decent. I've personally have never really tanked too hard content on a Templar tank, but I have seen other tanks run Templar tanks in sort of endgame content. So, for example, Asylum Hard Mode, I believe one of the first clears on PC NA was with a Templar off tank. So, again, Templar tanks, just because you gotta lack the same tools that Dragonites and Nightblades have, doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad tank. It just means you might need to work a little bit harder to kind of make up for your deficits. So, like our other build videos, we will not be going over gear in this video. That is for a separate video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right now. So, if you guys want to know what gear I'm running, or the different gear sets that you might want to run as a tank, feel free to pause this video, go ahead and check out that gear video up there, and then come back here when you are ready to go over skills, as well as the general philosophy behind tanking. So again, this video is just looking at skills and taking a look at sort of the philosophy behind tanking and kind of my personal approach to tanking. So without further ado, let's get started with our skills. So Templars, you do have quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to bar space. That's one of your strengths as a Templar tank. You do have you have a little bit more flex bust than other tanks do, partially because some of your abilities, again, you don't have as many abilities that kind of provide group utility compared to like a Dragonite or a Nightblade tank. So for our Sword and Board bar, we have Pierce Armor. You can go with the other morph, which is Ransack. However, Templar tanks do have a source of minor protection, so it's not absolutely necessary to run Ransack on a Templar. Next, we have Heroic Slash for the minor maim and the minor heroism. Next, we have a flex spot here for a self-heal. One of the big weaknesses of Templar tanks is that your self-heals are either inconsistent or not very strong. So in terms of self-heals, this is just one potential option. That is Living Dark. So this basically heals you for, in this instance, 1500 health or so, once every half second. So overall, it's going to be 3k health per second, which isn't terrible. It lasts for 6 seconds, so that's, again, not that bad. The main issue with Living Dark is that it has only procs on direct damage. So if you have a lot of dots sticking on you, so for example in like Black Rose Prison where you have a lot of dots going on you, Living Dark isn't going to proc. So you kind of have a little bit of kind of limitations here with this self-heal. The other potential self-heals that you might want to run would be something like Ritual Rebirth or Hasty Prayer. The main weakness would be out of these is that it scales off of your spell damage and max magicka, of which you're a tank, so you don't really have very good spell damage and you don't have really good max magicka. So your overall heal is not going to be very strong. Here you can see we're healing for 7250 and our max health is around 3500. 35,000 I should say. So we're only getting about a 20% max heal with Ritual Rebirth for an enormous cost of 6852 magicka. So again, Templar heal, not that great. Honor the Dead, a little bit better in terms of magicka cost, 4,314 magicka, same amount of heal. The downside is Honor the Dead might not hit you. If you're not the one with the lowest amount of health, you're not going to get that heal. And again, you're not healing for a lot. It's only about 20% of our max health here. So very inconsistent self-heals with Templar tanks. That's one of the primary weaknesses of Templar tanks, which kind of draws people away from them just because you're relying a lot more on your healer in order to maintain your overall health. The next ability is going to be Radiant Ward. You can go with the other morph of Radiant Ward, which is Blazing Shield if you prefer. This is, I think, one of the Templar tanks' stronger suits, which is the fact that they have a damage shield that actually scales very nicely. So unlike the DK tank's personal shield, which only is about 8%, Radiant Ward here scales off of your max health, and it roughly is about 30 to 33% of your overall shield, over your health as a shield. Pretty nice. Plus, you also get some additional shield strength if you have a lot of enemies around you. That goes for both Radiant Ward and Blazing Shield. So this is actually a pretty decent shield. So that's one of the Templar's strength. They have a pretty nice class-based shield, and this also does proc. Where is it? Spear Wall, which does give you the minor protection. So as long as you have the shield up, because it lasts for 6 seconds, you will also have that minor protection. So pretty good buffer for any sort of big damages that you might be anticipating. And then we have Power of the Light. This is another flex spot here. Normally you'll have a Templar healer running this, but if you don't have a Templar healer or you don't have a Stamplar running this, you'll be running Power of Light instead in order to maintain that minor fracture, minor breach. This does cost some stamina, so just keep that in mind here if you decide to run this, but this is typically going to be a flex spot for a couple of other abilities we will be going over the next few minutes. Next, in terms of ultimates, few choices for ultimates. This is one of them, Solar Prison for a source of major maim. This is one of the only sources of major maim in the game, and it lasts for quite a bit. So this lasts for 10 seconds. So pretty strong. Not really going to be used too much in score pushes. You might end up using this for kind of trash fights in order for the massive damage energy that it helps provide. But this is mostly for progression groups to help mitigate large damage scenarios like a hard mode execute or Hall's Fabrication final boss execute. For our back bar, I'm assuming you're running an Ice Staff or Lightning Staff. We have Inner Rage as our range taunt. Balance, this will give us some additional magicka to help out our sustain. It does provide that major resolve for physical and spell resistance, but we're also getting that from restoring focus as well. So we're not really primarily running this for the resistances, this is mostly for the magicka sustain. Then we have Extended Ritual here as a heal over time, a self-heal over time. It also provides additional synergy for your DPS, so always nice to have on hand. Then we have Restoring Focus. This is for the stamina sustain, as well as the resistances that you get. Templar tanks, you guys have a pretty easy time getting up to the the resistance cap, because while you're standing in your rune, you get an additional 50% physical and spell resistance. So you get an additional about 2,600 additional resistances from the major resolve. So really easy to get up to the resistance cap on a Templar tank, as long as you're able to stay within that rune. And then finally, you're running Blockade, either with a Lightning Staff or a Frost Staff, but if you're running a bow, then you'll be running Endless Hail instead. Then we have Aggressive Warhorn here as our next ultimate. These abilities back here, I really wouldn't call flex too much. Arguably, Balance is a flex spot. You can replace this with one potential ability, Meditate, if you have access to the Strategic Order line. But the other abilities here, I'd probably say you want to keep. Extended Ritual for the small heal over time, that self-heal, which could be pretty useful. And obviously Restoring Focus for the stamina sustain. So this just helps you restore stamina while you're blocking. And then obviously Blockade to help proc enchants, and Endless Hail to proc enchants as well. Now in terms of other abilities that you might want to have on hand, Focused Charge is actually a pretty good ability, but you're going to want to run Toppling Charge here because it'll always set enemies off balance. So pretty much an on-demand off balance here. Pretty nice to have, a Toppling Charge, but generally speaking there are a little bit easier ways to get off balance that don't really require you to run this ability. So while you want to have it in the back of your mind, it's not really something that you will be running too often. The next ability, if you want, you can run Shards if you want to help return some resources back to your group, but it does require you to kind of pay a little bit of attention to where you're throwing your shards, and doesn't really provide anything for you either outside of that minor protection from Spear Wall. So I don't typically run shards on a Templar tank. Dawn's Wrath line, not much here besides Living Dark and Power of the Light. Restoring Light, we already talked about the self-heals, 2 optional self-heals, Ritual of Rebirth and Honor of the Dead, in place of Living Dark. Repentance is another good ability to have on hand. So this basically heals you and your allies for a certain amount of health for each corpse that you have, and then also restores stamina. Now, obviously, the limitation is you gotta have corpses nearby. So for trash pulls, really nice to be able to kind of top off your stamina pool, top off your health pool for everybody. But if you're in a boss fight where you don't have ads, you don't have corpses to repent, then obviously this ability doesn't really do much for you. You can still slot it for the additional regen, so you get the health, stamina, magicka regen while you have it slotted. But it's not going to be that useful for the additional regen. So if you're not in a fight where you can take advantage of this, you typically won't be running Repentance at all. Under the one-handed line, I do want to point out Absorb Missile and Defensive Stance are both potentially useful skills to have on hand if you are fighting something with projectiles. Absorb Missile in particular is really nice because it acts as a self-heal, so definitely skills that you might want to have on hand. You can only run this on the sword and board bar, obviously, but really helpful in those niche scenarios where you are fighting against things that are shooting projectiles at you. I also want to point out Shield Discipline and Spell Wall as potential ultimates on your front bar here. That just basically allows you to heavy attack all you want to get some additional stamina back. Not really used all too often, but it is an option if you want to go that route. Under the Destruction Staff line, you might want to pick up Crushing Shock just for a ranged interrupt. Always nice to have that ability to interrupt things at range. And also Elemental Drain, just in case you need to run Ele Drain for whatever reason. So it's always nice to have those two abilities on hand if you're running Destruction Staff. If you're running a Bow Bar, you'd be running Venom Arrow as the ranged interrupt instead, but you don't really have an equivalent sort of ability to Ele Drain. So you'll just be running Venom Arrow as a ranged interrupt. Again, nice to have, not something you're going to be running very often, if at all. I do want to point out that Unstoppable, either Immovable or Unstoppable Brute, do have their niche uses because of that immunity to getting knocked down, especially from Immovable here. So definitely a niche skill to keep in the back of your head in case you ever need to, just stand there and just take and not bother getting knocked back or anything like that. Just bear in mind that if you do use this ability, you will have very limited movement speed. With a 7 heavy armor, you'll basically not be able to move at all. With 5, you're being reduced down to 10% of your overall movement speed. Just keep that in mind before you decide to run this ability. You will be giving up a lot of mobility by using this. In the Fighter's Guild line, might want to pick up Ring of Preservation for a fairly decent heal. It's not quite as strong as other heals we've covered, so it's a total of 481 every half second on this build. You're also going to be using this mainly for the minor protection as well. So in instances where people are going to be stacked up, you get the minor protection for everybody around you. You get the additional heal for everybody within this circle. So a nice ability to have on hand. You also want to have Silver Leash. This is going to be what you use to pull ads in. Templars, you don't really have a chains. You don't have something equivalent to the Warden portal or the DK chains. So you're going to have to run Silver Leash instead. This does use stamina, so just be mindful of how much stamina you're using up as you're chaining things and using Silver Leash. I already talked about balance on the Mage's Guild line. The alternative to running balance would be to run Meditate instead. So this provides health, stamina, and magicka back. But it is a channeled, so you won't be able to block while you are channeling this. So you won't be able to get the additional mitigation from block. Now this can be offset a little bit by getting Deliberation, which gives you the major protection while you're channeling Meditate, but it's not going to be as much mitigation as if you were just straight up blocking. Just keep that in mind. This is pretty nice because you don't have to necessarily give up health in order to get the additional magicka, and it returns stamina as well. Definitely an ability I would recommend picking up if you have access to the Sigil Order line. Also under the Sigil Order line, for a hard CC, you can pick up Time Freeze or Borrowed Time. This is going to be one of the best sources of hard CCs in the game, so it does cost quite a bit of magicka, over 6,000 magicka to use, but Templars don't really have a hard CC in their toolkit, so this is really the only way to get it. I also want to point out Temporal Guard for permanent minor protection. If you don't want to use Radiant Ward for the minor protection, you can just run Temporal Guard instead. You'll always get the minor protection as long as you're on that bar where you have it slotted. Finally, the Undaunted skill line, you're going to want to have all these abilities. Obviously, Inner Rage for the ranged taunt, Overflowing Altar for the Blood Feast synergy and the minor lifesteal, Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy. It's not quite as strong as it used to be, but it's still pretty decent. Bone Surge for the Major Vitality from the synergy, and then Energy Orb for the Combustion synergy as well as the heal. It's actually a fairly decent heal, as you can see here. It actually heals for more than what Ring of Preservation would heal for, 706 in this particular instance, every half second. So definitely a good ability to have on hand, especially if you're running something like Symphony of Blades where you need something to heal other people. Under the Alliance War line, obviously you want Aggressive Warhorn. You can also run Vigor as a AoE heal as well, so nice for proccing anything that requires you to heal other people, like Symphony of Blades. Under the support line, another ultimate you can run is Reviving Barrier for the shield and the heal. Also, it provides additional Magicka regen if you have the Magicka Aid passive, as long as you have it slotted. And also Efficient Purge, which you might not necessarily need because you have a Purge already through the Ritual, Standard Ritual. But if you need to purge other people, then Efficient Purge is a better way to go about this. But again, you do have access to a Self-purge to Extended Ritual, and it's also a little bit cheaper than Efficient Purge. So it might be better just to run an Extended Ritual rather than an Efficient Purge if all you need is a Self-purge. That's pretty much all the different abilities that you can run as a Templar. So again, quite a few flex spots. Living Dark is a flex spot, but you want to fill it with a self-heal, so not really a flex spot. It's more of like a quasi-flex spot. Power of the Light, flex spot on the front bar here. Then on the back bar here, not really too much here. You can kind of swap out Extended Ritual if you'd like. This is probably one of the more flexible spots on the back bar. And if you don't need the stamina sustain from restoring focus, for example, let's say you are running Meditate and don't really need the Major Resolve because maybe you have a Warden healer that's running Ice Fortress or Expansive Frostcloak for the Major Resolve. In that case, you can also drop Restoring Focus as well. You can also don't necessarily need to run Radiant Ward either. I personally like it because it helps proc minor protection and it's a pretty nice shield. But you don't necessarily need to run this either. You can obviously swap this out as you see fit. In terms of how to approach tanking in general. So tanking in ESO is very different from tanking in some other MMOs in the fact that you are mostly to serve as a support for the DPS. Your primary job, outside of obviously obvious, which is keep taunt, stay alive, your next job is actually to help improve the DPS. And that comes from various amounts of different ways. So you can buff your DPS through sets, like let's say you're wearing Yolnahkriin, you can give them minor courage that way. Or you can go provide debuffs. So for example, you're running Alkosh, and you're able to debuff enemy resistances using the Alkosh synergy, the Alkosh set synergy. So a couple of ways to improve overall DPS. So that's kind of the goal of tanks. So for a lot of endgame tank stuff, as you kind of get through more and more content and you get deeper into the endgame PvE content, you'll find that tanks are more about optimizing how much damage you're able to provide for the overall group. And that's one of the reasons why Templar tanks are not really used too often in endgame groups, because the class buff that you're able to provide, that unique class buff, is minor sorcery, which can already be provided through running Power of the Light on a Templar healer. So Templar tanks don't really provide too much outside of what a Templar healer can already really provide. Yes, they might have a little bit of additional survivability with the mana protection and the larger shield. They might bring in an additional synergy through Purify and things like that, but overall there's nothing that a Templar tank can provide that a Templar healer can't already provide. And so that's why Templar tanks are kind of unpopular among the endgame community, mainly because, again, nothing that a Templar tank can provide, a Templar healer can't. That being said, though, Templar tanks are definitely more than capable of clearing all pieces of content in the game. Like I mentioned, the first, or one of the first VAS hard mode clears on PCNA was with a Templar off tank. So, as a tank, your first job is obviously to taunt things and stay alive. A dead tank obviously is not a good tank, and obviously a tank that can't taunt things is not a good tank either. But beyond that, you should be focusing in on maintaining buffs and debuffs. Most of that's going to be coming from sets as well as abilities. So things like Blockade or Endless Hail on your back bar, that's one way you can help overall DPS, especially if you're running something like a Crush or enchant to help reduce overall resistances. So as a tank, your first job should be to kind of learn the mechanics of the fight, be able to survive, know what you can dodge roll, things like that. But once you get to the point where you're comfortable with the fight mechanics and how to survive, you want to focus in on maximizing debuff uptimes. Start to time out your synergies so to maximize the Alkosh debuff uptime. Make sure to pay attention to your Blockade uptime to make sure you're getting the most out of your enchants on your back bar. Those kind of things. So that's kind of what separates really good tanks from not so great tanks. It kind of helped you guys out a little bit because I know just talking about tanking is not really the same as seeing somebody tank. I do tank very often. I am a tank main. So if you go to my Twitch channel on the description, as well as the streams archives playlist, You will find a lot of tank perspective videos for mostly Sunspire, but there are a couple of other trials the further back you go in time. They are usually not going to be on Templar tanks, they're mostly on either Warden or DK tanks, but the principles kind of remain the same. The skills might change, but the principles of tanking remain the same across all the classes. So if you want to kind of see how I approach tanking in general, I would recommend taking a look at the Twitch channel as well as the Streams Archive playlist on my YouTube channel. Well, that concludes this video. Hopefully you guys found this informative. If you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Again, the main principles behind tanking all remain the same across classes, so I'll try to answer those pretty well. But if you have anything specific to Templars, I might not necessarily be able to answer them, so I will try to ask around to see if I can get a specific answer for Templar tank specific questions. Again, hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.